Hi, and welcome to the Anti-Politica channel. I'm Jovan Grahovec. It's been a while. Today I would like to do a follow-up video to some previous videos in which I talk about different kinds of fascism and different kinds of threats we may be facing today. Terms like Nazi, fascist, communist, and so forth are thrown around these days very frequently and very carelessly, primarily to smear political opponents and their views. So this is a dangerous threat because we are sort of destroying our language and the meaning of words, which basically prevents us from thinking clearly and communicating. So the primary purpose of this video will be to restore some sense to the debate and help us think more clearly about different kinds of totalitarianism, and moreover, and hopefully help us be able to identify some warning signals so that we can react to potential future threats on time. I also wrote an article that I put on Substack, so the link will be provided in the description of this video, and I invite you to check out the write-up of these ideas. So without any delay, let's go right into it.
As the term totalitarianism suggests, we are talking about a society in which there is a group, typically led by a strong leader, that exercises total or near total control over the rest of the society. And they do that by controlling levers of power such as the police, the military, the courts, the prosecutors, and so forth. Now, money and power go hand in hand, and this group will typically try to control the economy and extract money from businesses and take over most natural resources and riches of the country. And the reason they do that is because, of course, first they like money, and the other reason is that if they didn't do that and allowed somebody else to get rich or independently wealthy, they could challenge their power. So it's a preemptive move to make sure that nobody can challenge you. You end up controlling most of the economy. Similarly, because you want to make your power permanent and enjoy your profits and racket and other sources of money, you crack down on individual rights and free speech because you know that if you allow opposition, they will challenge you. So you will typically crack down on individual freedoms as well. You may even crack down on individual property and charge people exorbitant taxes just to enjoy their property or have their houses and so forth. In order to make your monopolies profitable in your economy, you will typically also limit economic freedoms that people can enjoy. So this little chart shows us the four mutually reinforcing characteristics of totalitarian societies. And now we can use these four boxes to basically evaluate and analyze different totalitarian societies and think about them in a somewhat rigorous manner. Of course, if you look at the world around us, it's very rich and diverse, and some countries are free countries, and these are typically liberal democracies that don't fill any of the four boxes. But then if you think about Pol Pot in Cambodia and some murderous dictatorial regimes, they fill each of the boxes to the top and then some. We can think of several well-known and important kinds of totalitarianism, such as communism, fascism, Nazism, and so forth. And what we'll do here is basically look at how each one of those regimes fills the four boxes that we just talked about. On the right-hand side, we have the two types of power that totalitarians are typically after. And on the left, we have two types of individual human rights that totalitarian systems typically attack. So we'll look at different examples and try to draw some conclusions from our comparisons. Importantly, Mussolini himself defined fascism as merger of state and corporate power, and this is the definition that many people who have read history and know about these things use, and they identify this merger with fascism itself. However, I would argue that this merger characterizes all kinds of totalitarian societies. So in a sense, this definition is too broad. This definition, in my mind, describes pretty much any totalitarian society, and I will later on propose a slightly narrower definition of fascism, the type that Mussolini created in Italy in the early 20s of the last century. What I will also propose is that we can classify these different totalitarian regimes based on where this merger between political and economic power comes from. In the first case, it could be that those with economic power co-opt or buy out or conquer political power. In the second case, it could be that a group that somehow acquires political power then reaches for the economic power. And the third case would be a case in which political and economic elites mingle and together do a sort of a joint venture or a merger of equals of sort. So let's talk about fascism. I propose the definition of fascism as the acquisition of political power by those who already have economic power and removal of checks and balances on political power and subsequent crackdown on individual rights and especially free speech. One might wonder what the difference between crony capitalism and fascism is, and I would argue that this is precisely it. In crony capitalism, rich people tend to buy favors from politicians, and this happens behind the scenes. But in a fascist society, this becomes normalized and is followed by a crackdown on individual rights, free speech, and even removal of checks and balances. In fascist societies, they may act to remove the parliament and give the dictator uncontested total powers, which is not the case in crony capitalism. I propose that this definition fits Mussolini's fascism, and I provide more details in the article that you can read on Substack. The idea is that Italy was experiencing a great deal of unrest and political instability in the aftermath of the First World War. And remember that this is the time right after the communist revolution in Russia. So Italian workers are getting similar ideas. There was a whole bunch of takeovers of factories and various enterprises by the workforce, which really scared Italian industrialists and landowners. They were unhappy with the state that seemed unable or unwilling to protect them, so they turned to Mussolini and his fascists to protect their interests, and they quickly basically helped him rise to power, and they were hoping that he would steer Italy through very turbulent times in Europe and the world in ways that would protect their interests. So this type of totalitarianism I associate with fascism. Mussolini's fascism was naturally nationalistic, militaristic and expansionist because Italy wanted to catch up with other big European countries and get its own colonies so that they can have cheap raw materials and captive markets for their products. Now, if you think about the danger of something like that happening today, it seems remote. That is, in the meantime, enterprises and corporations and capital in general have become much more international and even global. We see all these giant global corporations that are now the size of economies of mid-sized countries. So the situation we are facing today is very different from Europe in the 20s and 30s of the last century. If anything, we should be worried about these giant global corporations and these wealthy international capitalist elites taking over our governments, which are now much smaller compared to them. And moreover, they can infiltrate global organizations such as the United Nations and the World Trade Organization and so forth. So if anything, the threat of fascism today could be of very different nature as far as nationalist versus globalist than what we saw in the 20th century. The 20th century fascism was naturally nationalistic, but perhaps the new wave of fascism may be globalist. And it may be very difficult for us to control because it's difficult for our national governments, especially in smaller and mid-sized countries, to face giants of today, such as Google, Apple, and so forth. And moreover, these globalist corporations have easy access to international organizations that we really have poor oversight of. It's very difficult to see how a voter voting in Alabama or Wisconsin, how much they have visibility into what happens at World Trade Organization and how their representative, even in the US Congress, may be able to influence how these trade deals are done and how these global regulations are done. And these are clearly important rules and laws that get set at the international level that we have very, very little control over. And these big global corporations can relatively easily infiltrate, and without us even maybe knowing it. So as far as fascism, the real threat of fascism in the 21st century may be precisely of a globalist rather than nationalist fascism, and it could be that our national parliaments are our best defense. So it could be that rather than a threat, which it was in the 20th century, nationalism could be our best hope moving forward, in the sense that we need to bring back some of the authority from international organizations back to our national parliaments, and we need to be really vigilant and monitor our representatives to make sure that they work in our interest rather than in the interest of global corporations. Now let's look at the other type of totalitarianism that arises when political power grabs economic power and cracks down on free speech and individual rights and freedoms. This can happen in a variety of ways. A whole bunch of different groups with different motivations can do this in a whole bunch of different ways. So things will look very different from case to case here, and we don't have a good common name. However, we have some typical cases that can happen, and we can draw some conclusions. Unfortunately, in many newly liberated countries, we have a situation in which former freedom fighters and resistance movements become very powerful politically all of a sudden, and then the temptation to grab resources and become very rich very fast and to make themselves permanent rulers of the country, that temptation tends to be very, very strong. And we see this over and over again across Africa, Middle East, and other parts of the world. And you could call these regimes thugocracies, because they turn into thugs that ruthlessly manage their country. They suppress political freedoms, and they really extract huge resources and profits out of countries that are typically very, very poor. So this is a sad turn of events when former freedom fighters and regimes that start with high hopes end up in a very, very bad spot. And then it can kind of go on and on forever, especially if there is an ethnic component, as is the case in Libya and Iraq, when the freedom movement is dominated by one ethnic group or one clan. They rise to power, they abuse everybody else until they face their own revolution, and then somebody else comes along, and then they start to oppress the others, and you have this kind of endless cycle of violence, the kind of which we see in Libya these days. The other kind of totalitarian regimes is ideologically or religiously based. So Islamic revolution in Iran, or what we saw in Afghanistan is a type of theocracy. And it's interesting how the more extreme the theocracy is, the worse for the society, and then the more problematic for themselves. It's interesting how the Iranian regime has been much more stable than Afghanistan, which is probably largely explained by the fact that the Iranian regime is not as totalitarian as the one that they have in Afghanistan. The Iranian regime really exercises tight control over some sectors of the economy, but they left other sectors to private enterprise. They left private property untouched, and they just focused on controlling some cultural issues and cracking down on certain individual rights and freedoms, but leaving others untouched. So the more totalitarian you are, the worse, and the shorter the lifespan of your dictatorship will likely be, holding all other factors equal. It's also interesting how these ideological totalitarian regimes can be super, super harsh. And we saw that with Mao and Stalin in communist regimes, and we saw that with Nazis in Germany and in the 30s and the 40s. I argue in the paper that the Nazi regime is more of this type than of the other type. That is, whereas the economic elites supported Mussolini and fascists in Italy from the get-go, and they installed them in power pretty fast, Hitler wasn't popular, and his National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany wasn't popular among German industrialists and capitalists all the way to the end, and they kind of joined the regime once they had no choice. Hitler won an important referendum, and at that point he had absolute powers, and all that German industrialists and capitalists could do is just kind of go with the flow, and there was no way for them to influence Hitler the way Mussolini was kind of cultivated over from the beginning by the Italian industrialists and landowners. So that's an interesting argument I present in that paper that you can read on Substack. So how about today? Are we facing any risks of this type of totalitarianism arising in our future? We should always be careful when there is rapid political change. That's a clear suggestion of the analysis, because the newly powerful may try to acquire economic power as well. We should also be careful with statism. That is the idea that the political class may justify its increasing involvement in the economy and increased centralization. That by itself may not necessarily be totalitarianism, but it's really worrying if it's accompanied with the crackdown on free speech and reduction of political rights, and especially when we see politicians and members of their families become involved in the economy and business. That's a sign that something bad is happening in the society. Another thing to really watch for is when these the crackdown on individual rights and involvement in the economy is justified by some greater social good or goal. And that's very ideological, and we always have to keep in mind that, of course, not every socialism is bad, and there will be a follow-up video about how to keep socialism good. But it's interesting how Hitler's movement started as National Socialism. There was very little socialist in it, but it appealed to that kind of instinct in people. So it turned into Nazism, and it became very, very vicious and ugly. And Of course, we are not accusing anybody, but there is always that remote possibility that some noble goals of today may turn things on its head. And what if the global, woke globalist socialism one day becomes something more nasty, and we might call it Wattsism if it becomes that. Of course, nobody is suggesting that this is Hitler-like situation, but it may become more oppressive and it may become totalitarian, and the time to watch for that is on time rather than when things spin out of control. The final third case may arise when the political elite and the economic elite kind of marry each other. They intermingle. The political seek to monetize their power. The rich seek to enlarge their wealth and bribe politicians. They go back and forth. They may start to intermarry. There might be turnover between the two. And they end up being one, in which case it's very likely they'll start to reduce freedoms of others, and they will become an oligarchy of sorts. So what are the worrying reasons here? Of course, as always, attacks on free speech and other individual rights. So whenever you see politicians becoming ultra-rich and they're cracking down on your rights, that's a time to worry. And in this particular case, we'll see blurring between business and politics, and also corporations becoming increasingly involved in politics and doing things that the state should do. Maybe that's something that we are seeing these days in the United States with Zuckerbucks for elections and so forth. It seems that too much corporate social responsibility, when it turns into taking over functions of the state, that should be a worrying sign, especially if it's accompanied with crackdowns on free speech and so forth. So it could be, and this is a final thought from the analysis here, if you look at the United States, it could be that we are seeing sort of a merger of the political class and the economic elite. And it could be that they are really, really happy with each other, that it's a happy marriage, in which case we need to resist them together and really defend our free speech and our political rights, and demand politicians to separate from the economic elite through the democratic mechanisms that we have. Or it could be that these two elites have different goals and different agendas for the future. What if from the political side we have woke socialists that have one design for the future, and on the corporate side we have global corporate fascists, and they're kind of doing a marriage of convenience and reducing freedom of speech and cracking down on our rights, and then there may have a showdown between themselves moving forward. And if this is the case, who would you bet on? Would you bet on the woke socialists or corporate fascists? Who would win in that showdown? And how might we, as the rest of the public, use that wedge between them to easier protect our democracy and our individual rights? So I go over this again in the paper on Substack that I recommend you read, but this is it as far as the analysis that I wanted to present here.
As you can see, the situation is pretty troubling around the world. There are lots of warning signs. And what's also interesting is that movements such as MAGA or Dutch farmers or Gilets jaunes in France, which are often accused of being Nazi, fascist, and totalitarian, based on this analysis, are anything but. And real threats seem to be coming from elsewhere. So I will make a follow-up video in which I will focus on the United States and Canada to really dig deeper into some of these warning signs and talk about the threats of potential totalitarianism we seem to be facing today. So stay tuned for that. And if you like this video, please feel free to subscribe and share it, and give us a thumbs up down below. And of course, I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts, and I will get to them as soon as I can, and try to respond to all of them. So with that, good luck. I'll see you soon.